some scholars have argued that the artistic energy of Christians in the Byzantine Empire went toward the beautification of the word. This is where we get iconography from, many of the beautiful icons of Byzantine tradition and later on. Now, the celebration of the word of God in Islam is the Quran. Hence, the beautiful calligraphy, the art of calligraphy as it develops out of this high reverence for the word of God. So in all of these aspects, it clearly shows how very central the Quran is to the religious tradition. Now, lest we understand from here that Muhammad is unimportant, that is obviously not the case. We had talked earlier about Muhammad's central position when it comes to understanding God's revelation. That is to say, Muslims agree that God did send guidance through the Quran to humankind. But in order to make sense of the guidance, in order to know what is meant when God addresses a particular issue, it is always the example of Muhammad that is being drawn upon to make sense of the Quran where there are questions. And this is, of course, a natural extension of Muhammad's role as a prophet. If anybody in the early Muslim community would understand what God really meant when he sent the Quran, the obvious candidate would, of course, be Muhammad himself, who was chosen by God to be that prophet.
Was the message of Muhammad universal or just particular to his community?
Right. There is somewhat of a tension, I would say, in some of the verses, early verses, where the Quran is talking about itself as being an Arab Quran, a Quran for the Arabs. But that does not mean that the Quran is a message exclusively and solely for the Arabs. Rather, some scholars understand these references to Arab and the Arabness of the Quran to mean that finally the Arabs themselves are receiving a message. We had talked earlier about the universality of revelation. And so in that sense, the Arabs get their own revelation. So I would read those verses not as verses that are particularistics, but rather I would understand many of the other verses that clearly outshine these particularist verses to indicate that the Quran is a guidance to all of mankind. The Quran, again, in its theology, is universal in outlook, so that Islam itself as a religious tradition is not a religious tradition that is just limited to a particular people, but is a religious tradition that is itself universally in outlook.
Were there letters that were written by Muhammad and sent to neighboring countries?
Yes, again, the early...
inviting them to Islam.
Exactly. The early tradition tells us during the year of deputation that Muhammad invited the rulers of the day to come to Islam. Now, in this particular context, we're talking about some of the neighboring kingdoms, some of the neighboring empires. So the Byzantine emperor is said to have received one such invitation toward Islam. The Persian emperor is said to have received one. The Muqawqis of Egypt, and then sometimes also the ruler of Abyssinia that received these messages, these invitations to Islam.
Dr. Teipen, our program is drawing to a close. Would you discuss the legacy of Muhammad and Islam to today?
The legacy of Muhammad and Islam is oftentimes overlooked in the Western world. When you look at the larger picture of this one man who is described as having been unlettered, coming out of the Arabian Peninsula, giving rise to this major religious tradition of Islam with a following of 1.3 billion Muslims today. His impact has been enormous. Not only that, in terms of numbers, what I would want to emphasize is, and again, this is very often overlooked in the Western part of the world, is the immense contributions that Islamic civilization, again, a civilization that grows out of this message that Muhammad brought, that this Islamic civilization has made for the development of civilization and science in the Western world. On occasion with my students at Furman University, I play this game, thinking about ways in which our world has been impacted by the world of Islamic civilization. And I draw on the blackboard in the Latin numerals a couple of numbers. So I draw a 125 and a 75. Now these are Latin numerals. As you know, Latin numerals are very hard to decipher. You don't have any place value system in there. And so adding two simple numbers in those numerals is very hard to do. And then right next to it, I draw the same numbers in the Arab alphabet. And of course, every student within a second can answer the question of how much is 125 and 75. Now, it's a very brief exercise, and it is just one of many examples where you can show that Islamic civilization has had this huge impact on the way within which the modern Western world has developed. It is through the centers of Islamic learning, it is through the Baghdad under the Abbasids, bringing much knowledge, philosophy, and scientific materials that actually had been developed to a certain extent by the Greeks of old, becoming translated into Arabic and informing the rise of this brilliant civilization under the Abbasids and later on. And then from there, through the Iberian Peninsula, through what is nowadays Spain and Portugal. It was under Muslim control, part of it under Muslim control from 711 to 1492. It is through that direction and some other directions that also connect with Islam that much of this ancient knowledge is finding its way into a medieval Europe that at that point in time, according to some historians, still lived in the Dark Ages. So there's an enormous debt that goes unacknowledged in much of Western discourse that the so-called Western world owes to the Muslims in terms of philosophy, in terms of theology, and in terms of science. So that up to today, when you look at certain technological terms, oftentimes you can just look at the Arabic definite article al, algebra, algorithm, azimuth, all of those are of Arab origin.
Dr. Teipen, it has been a pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you.
That's it for now. For Perspectives on Faith, I'm Metin Tekke. Until next time, goodbye.